Hi, this is Pat Johnson, your psychology instructor. In this mini lecture, we're going to talk about diagnosing psychological disorders using the DSM System of Classification. The DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's written by the American Psychiatric Association. Now clue into that second word, psychiatric. This is not written by mostly psychologists. It's mostly written by psychiatrists. And if you remember from the beginning of the semester, a psychiatrist is a medical doctor who treats people with mental illnesses. So this is a very medical type book. The first DSM came out in 1952. It was a very small book. It had less than 100 pages, and it didn't really talk about specific symptoms for specific disorders. That came along with further editions of the DSM. This picture on the left kind of looks almost like the bookcase behind me, in that I have older editions of the DSM on my bookshelf. We've gone through many editions and revisions of the DSM over the years. The most frequent edition of the DSM is DSM-5, which came out in 2013. That was a really exciting year for psychology because we had been using DSM-4 TR, meaning the fourth edition, text revised, a mini step between DSM-4 and DSM-5. We had been using DSM-4 TR since the year 2000. So when the DSM-5 came out, there were lots of changes. Some of the changes in DSM-5 were some disorders were added. Things that you've heard of but hadn't, or you might have heard of, but weren't in DSM-4 are things like binge eating disorder and hoarding disorder. Those are actual categories in the DSM-5 edition now. Another disorder that's been added is disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. You probably haven't heard of that one. That one was added because too many little kids were being given the diagnosis of being bipolar and being given medication that can sometimes do some not so great things to the developing brain. So a new category was come up with, and that is disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. These are just three examples, not nearly exhaustive, of all the additions that have come to the DSM. Some disorders were removed. There is a disorder that most all of you have heard of called Asperger's disorder. Well, that's not in the DSM anymore. What we would have called somebody with Asperger's disorder is now part of the autism spectrum group of disorders. So somebody who might have been labeled Asperger's before would be on the mild end of autism spectrum. Some disorders were moved. Some of the disorders that used to be in the category of anxiety disorders, like PTSD and OCD, meaning post-traumatic stress disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder, those have been moved to other areas of the DSM and out of the group of disorders called anxiety disorders. Again, these are just a few of the changes that have occurred to show you that a lot has changed in DSM-5. There are some benefits to using the DSM system of classification. First of all, it gives us a common language. I chose this picture to show you three doctors consulting. Well, let's suppose instead of having a DSM system of classification, each doctor just came up with their own idea of what a mental illness was. So then when they were discussing a client, they would each have their own set of symptoms of the different categories of mental illnesses. On the other hand, in the DSM system of classification, The symptoms for each disorder are laid out very clearly, and a client must fit into those different symptoms before they can be labeled with a disorder. And that's good. It gives us a common language. So all these different doctors, if they're discussing a case and they're all using the DSM System of Classification, they know what they mean when they are talking about a specific psychological disorder. The DSM system, although it doesn't list treatment and causes, it does help us pinpoint causes and treatments. And by this I mean just the fact that it organizes the different disorders and gives their symptoms helps researchers do research on the different causes and then also treatments that are beneficial for helping people with each disorder. Now that doesn't mean that everything about the DSM is good. There are a lot of criticisms. Some of the problems with the DSM System of Classification is, first of all, it casts too broad a net and makes almost everything a disorder. We could come up with some label that's in the DSM for everybody in this class, including myself. For example, caffeine intoxication. Yep, it's in the DSM. And there are some of us, myself included, who don't think that something like caffeine intoxication should be in a book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Another problem with the DSM system is that it labels people. Let's suppose you heard around campus from other students that Ms. Johnson, your teacher, well, she has a mental illness, and then the next class period you see her coming into the classroom dressed as Freud. Instead of it's a teacher using a pretty cool teaching technique to get across Freud's theory, all of a sudden, because you've heard that I have a mental illness, you start thinking of me as that crazy teacher who dresses up. Now, I don't really have a psychological disorder diagnosis, but you get the idea. When we see somebody who has a label attached to them of a mental illness, we start thinking of them as that mental illness, and we forget that they're a human being with all the feelings and desires and goals and dreams that all of us have. They just become that disorder. So that's a brief overview of the DSM System of Classification. It has its problems, but it's the best system of classification for mental illnesses out there. And it's the basis for the rest of the chapter.